As my memoir has now reached the period when I saw a great deal of my aunt and was old enough to understand something of her value, I will here attempt a description of her person, mind, and habits. In person she was very attractive. Her figure was rather tall and slender, her step light and firm, and her whole appearance expressive of health and animation. In complexion she was a clear brunette with a rich colour. She had full round cheeks with mouth and nose small and well formed, bright hazel eyes, and brown hair forming natural curls close around her head, if not so regularly handsome as her sister. Yet her countenance had a peculiar charm of its own to the eyes of most beholders. At the time of which I am now writing, she never was seen, either morning or evening, without a cap. I believe that she and her sister were generally thought to have taken the garb of middle age earlier than their years or their looks required, and that though remarkably neat in their dress as in all their ways, they were scarcely sufficiently regardful of the fashionable or the becoming. She was not highly accomplished according to the present standard. Her sister drew well, and it is from a drawing of hers that the likeness preferred has been taken. Jane herself was fond of music and had a sweet voice, both in singing and in conversation. In her youth she had received some instruction on the pianoforte, and at Chawton she practised daily, chiefly before breakfast. I believe she did so partly that she might not disturb the rest of the party, who were less fond of music. In the evening she would sometimes sing, to her own accompaniment, some simple old songs, the words and airs of which, now never heard, still linger in my memory. She read French with facility and knew something of Italian. In those days, German was no more thought of than Hindostani as part of a lady's education. In history, she followed the old guides, Goldsmith, Hume, and Robertson. Critical inquiry into the usually received statements of the old historians was scarcely begun. The history of the early kings of Rome had not yet been dissolved into legend. Historic characters lay before the reader's eyes in broad light or shade, not much broken up by details. The virtues of King Henry VIII were yet undiscovered, nor had much light been thrown on the inconsistencies of Queen Elizabeth. The one was held to be an unmitigated tyrant and an embodied Bluebeard, the other a perfect model of wisdom and policy. Jane, when a girl, had strong political opinions, especially about the affairs of the 16th and 17th centuries. She was a vehement defender of Charles I and his grandmother Mary, but I think it was rather from an impulse of feeling than from any inquiry into the evidences by which they must be condemned or acquitted. As she grew up, the politics of the day occupied very little of her attention, but she probably shared the feeling of moderate Toryism which prevailed in her family. She was well acquainted with the old periodicals from The Spectator downwards. Her knowledge of Richardson's works was such as no one is likely again to acquire, now that the multitude and the merits of our light literature have called off the attention of readers from the greater master. Every circumstance narrated in Sir Charles Grandison, all that was ever said or done in the Cedar Parlour, was familiar to her, and the wedding days of Lady L and Lady G were as well remembered as if they had been living friends. Amongst her favourite writers, Johnson in prose, Crabbe in verse, and Cooper in both stood high. It is well that the native good taste of herself and of those with whom she lived saved her from the snare into which her sister novelist had fallen, of imitating the grandiloquent style of Johnson. She thoroughly enjoyed Crabbe, perhaps on account of a certain resemblance to herself in minute and highly finished detail, and would sometimes say in jest that if she ever married at all, she could fancy being Mrs. Crabbe. Looking on the author quite as an abstract idea, and ignorant and regardless what manner of man he might be. Scott's poetry gave her great pleasure. She did not live to make much acquaintance with his novels. Only 3 of them were published before her death, but it will be seen by the following extract from one of her letters that she was remarkably prepared to admit the merits of Waverley. And it is also remarkable that, living as she did, far apart from the gossip of the literary world, she should even then have spoken so confidently of his being the author of it. Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and ought not to be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but I fear I must. I am quite determined, however, not to be pleased with Mrs. Should I ever meet with it, which I hope I may not. I think I can be stout against anything written by her. I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, E's, and my own. It was not, however, what she knew, but what she was that distinguished her from others. I cannot better describe the fascination which she exercised over children than by quoting the words of two of her nieces. One says, "As a very little girl, I was always creeping up to Aunt Jane and following her whenever I could in the house and out of it. I might not have remembered this but for the recollection of my mother's telling me privately that I must not be troublesome to my aunt. Her first charm to children was great sweetness of manner. She seemed to love you and you loved her in return. This, as well as I can now recollect, was what I felt in my early days before I was old enough to be amused by her cleverness. But soon came the delight of her playful talk. She could make everything amusing to a child. Then, as I got older, when cousins came to share the entertainment, she would tell us the most delightful stories, chiefly of fairyland, and her fairies had all the characters of their own. The tale was invented, I am sure, at the moment, and was continued for 2 or 3 days if occasion served. Again, when staying at Chawton with 2 of her other nieces, we often had amusements in which my aunt was very helpful. She was the one to whom we always looked for help. She would furnish us with what we wanted from her wardrobe, and she would be the entertaining visitor in our make-believe house. She amused us in various ways. Once I remember in giving a conversation as between myself and my 2 cousins, supposing we were all grown up the day after a ball. Very similar is the testimony of another niece. Aunt Jane was the general favourite with the children, her ways with them being so playful and her long, circumstantial stories so delightful. These were continued from time to time, and were begged for on all possible and impossible occasions, woven as she proceeded out of nothing but her own happy talent for invention. Ah! If but one of them could be recovered! And again, as I grew older, when the original 17 years between our ages seemed to shrink to 7 or to nothing, it comes back to me now how strangely I missed her. It had become so much a habit with me to put by things in my mind with a reference to her, and to say to myself, I shall keep this for Aunt Jane.